Good evening, good afternoon, dear friends, dear students of USP, MRS program, and NRPO program. This is a workshop, MRS workshop series lecture and talk by Marina Albee, an entrepreneur and educator living in St. Petersburg, Russia, and generally in Russia for, I think, about 3 decades so far. We're also happy to have Marina as one of our colleagues teaching here at European University St. Petersburg. So some of our students have already known Marina for some time, but others didn't. And we thought that there is quite a lot that Marina can share about her experience as an American that has moved at quite an early stage to Russia and lived through, through Russia's becoming a post-Soviet, the Russia that you see today after the post-Soviet collapse. And Marina has been a close witness of many of the events here. As you may have read already in the introduction to this event, Marina in the 1980s was a Ph.D. student then at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and from a very early stage she was one of those persons standing very close to the first contacts between the then USSR and later early post-Soviet Russia and the USA in the spheres of media, culture, I would think perhaps public diplomacy, you may correct me if I'm wrong, communications, business, etc. So there's a wealth of knowledge and experience which has fascinated me, over the times that we've met and talked to Marina, and we really wanted to make sure that more of our students and others who have joined this event could learn by hearing Marina's presentation today. So without further taking too much of your time further, I'd like to give the floor to Marina. We will have about a 40 minutes to 1 hour talk, followed by a Q&A session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Georg, very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to teach at the European University. As some of you know, I've been teaching in St. Petersburg for about 15 years at St. Petersburg State University at the Philfac for about 12 years, then at Harriman Institute at the Higher School of Economics. But I feel very much at home at the European University, basically because you have trusted me to create my own kind of curriculum. So I try to suit the needs of my students, and you've all been very accommodating to giving me enough freedom to teach the way I like to teach. So thank you very much for that and for inviting me today. I'm going to start right away with my presentation, and I will share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that. I call my presentation 10 Years That Shook My World. And if most of you probably know that I'm making a parody on John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, about the Bolshevik Revolution. And basically in my life, these 10 years were a revolution for me personally. This is a cover of Soviet Life that I put on the first slide because my father, when I was a kid, used to subscribe to Soviet Life. So I thought that this was one of my first images of what life was like in the Soviet Union, although I never really read the magazine because it was obviously a glamorous and glossy view of life. So let me see. The next slide was 1961, a very good year. This was the year I was born. It was also the year that Yuri Gagarin went up and flew around the Earth. And it was the year that the Soviet Union launched the Molniya satellite, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But because I am a historian by education, I think it's very important to describe the source of this information, the source that is me. So I call it my story. The feminists would say there's no such thing as history. You have to call it her story, but I call it my story. And I just wanted you to all to know who I am and where I came from, so you could evaluate what I'm saying better. My grandparents on my mother's side were Sicilian. They came to the United States from Sicily in 1914 to escape World War I. Unfortunately, my grandfather was drafted into the army as soon as he reached Ellis Island. They never spoke English. He was a street cleaner, and then he helped to build the Holland Tunnel under the Hudson River. On my father's side, George and Maud Albee, I never met those grandparents. They died before I was born. George and Maud were Pennsylvania Dutch and English. They lived in Pennsylvania, where my father grew up in St. Mary's. And both of my grandparents and my parents lived through the Great Depression at the end of the 20s and the 30s, and they were both from very poor families. My mother lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and she had 3 sisters. They slept 4 to a bed. My father died when my grandfather died when my father was 6, and my grandmother rented out rooms in their house. But during the Depression, people didn't have money to pay, so they used to pay her with deer meat, which we call venison in English, and trout from the stream. So we were brought up understanding the value of money. I was born in Rome, Italy. There's a picture of me on the left, my mother holding me. I just happened to be born there because my father was teaching in a sabbatical year in Rome. He was a psychology professor. We grew up in an old baron's house in Cleveland, Ohio, at least until I was 10. It was a big house, but kind of run down. And my mother, who was also a professor of social work, was late in getting married, and she had 4 children, to her great delight. These are the 4 children: my oldest brother, Alec, Luke, myself, and my sister, Sarah. This is our picture in childhood and grown up. And the reason I'm telling you all this is so that you understand my background. We grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and my parents were both radical professors, radical liberal progressive professors. We used to have dinner parties that lasted all night, and a lot of famous people would come, including some people that I have on the screen now. So if you don't know who they are, you can look them up. Betty Friedan was the first feminist. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was a historian and a politician. Eugene McCarthy ran for president in 1968. And then we moved to South Burlington, Vermont, and this is my father in his office. He looked a lot like Solzhenitsyn. And when I learned Russian, I taught him how to write "I'm not Solzhenitsyn" because people were always asking him for autographs. This is me in the center holding the soccer ball. I was brought up to be a feminist. When I came to Russia the first time, I realized that feminism is a bad word, so I started calling myself a humanist. But we were lucky enough to be living in a time when girls were allowed to have the same teams as boys. There was no discrimination in the school. So we lobbied the school and got the first girls soccer team. And I was the captain, and we won the state championships 2 years in a row. And when I finished college, I went to UVM and I studied French and European history. I really wanted to help save the world. And the area that I thought needed the most work was the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. These are some of the images of the Soviet Union that we had in our minds as Americans. Angela Davis and Gus Hall, who were the American Communist Party, Soviet athletes during the Olympics, and the Politburo with dour faces raising their hands in unison. And I decided after I graduated from college that I would go to Middlebury College to learn Russian because I wanted to work at the United Nations and I needed to learn another language and I wanted to specialize in Russian. So I went to Middlebury and took a 9-week course in Russian. My dad took me there, and I just here wrote a little bit about him. He was a professor of psychology at UVM. He was also the past president of the American Psychological Association. His specialty was community mental health and primary prevention of psychopathology, which is basically how to prevent people from going crazy. And his idea was, instead of giving people medication, you should change things in society that make people go crazy. For example, poverty, income inequality, sexism, racism, etc. So after I finished Middlebury College, I applied to graduate schools. And the reason I wanted to go to Columbia was because Jonathan Sanders was a professor there, and he had raised $40,000 to put in this antenna that was watching the Soviet satellite called Molniya. And Molniya was the first domestic satellite launched into space. But in 1961, when it was launched, they didn't have enough rocket power to put it up into geostationary orbit. So the antennas that were all across 11 time zones of the Soviet Union had to be turned by hand. And at Columbia, Jonathan found this guy named Kenny Schaefer. Well, he actually was living in Manhattan. Kenny had been looking for the Playboy channel above his apartment on 58th Street. And instead of finding the Playboy channel, he found the Molniya satellite, which was a modified CCAM signal. And Kenny is a brilliant inventor. He is also, he invented the wireless microphone, the wireless guitar. He did PR for Jimi Hendrix and Lenny Bruce, and he was part of the Roaring 60s. But he's really an inventor, and he invented a way to track the satellite using a computer. So every day in Columbia at 3 p.m., which was 7 a.m. in Moscow, we started to watch Soviet television. And here I am in our office on 515 Madison Avenue. So Soviet television, this was in 1985, was the main vehicle for glasnost, perestroika, and uskarение. Most people in the West know the words glasnost and perestroika, but we all forget that there was also the third word, which was uskarение. And I think that Gorbachov was hoping that he would change the time of stagnation of the Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov era and quickly move towards a new society. So some of my favorite TV shows, Nuka Devshki, which were, some of you probably don't remember this, competitions between housewives who could vacuum faster, etc. Spokojny noci malashi, which you all know. So I went to Moscow the first time. I didn't have any money, so I had to find 10 people to go. I put up notices on the blackboard at NYU and Columbia, and I found 10 people, and I got a free ticket. And I took 2 trips that way to the Soviet Union in 1985. And on one of the trips, Kenny Schaefer said to me, he went on the trip and he said, will you come with me to Soviet state television? Because the lawyers at Columbia are complaining that we're pirating the signal from the Soviets and it's illegal. And I want to ask them for permission. So Kenny and I went to Gosteleradio. We met with people there who all looked very dour and gray and all shook their heads, niet. But 3 months later, Kenny got in the mail, typed out license for us to use, for him to use Soviet television for educational purposes. So I was so excited at the fact that I left Columbia and I started to work with Kenny at his office and home on 21 West 58th Street. And in 1986, I created my own company with Jonathan Sanders' wife, Arlene, and Viktor Krylenko's wife, Cynthia. Viktor, you can see on the right side holding the Kalashnikov, was a Soviet man from Abakan who had married an American woman, Cynthia. And he found an ingenious way to work himself up to the top of the food chain, which was ghostwriting books of the Soviet leaders. So he started with Brezhnev, then he did Chernenko, then Andropov, and ultimately he organized for the biography of Boris Yeltsin as well. And Victor could basically talk anybody into anything. On the left side, you see me with an unfortunate haircut, holding a spectrum analyzer. Spectrum analyzer is you can see on my back, it's a little machine that helps you find satellites in the sky. And Kenny had me dress up like the Ghostbusters, and this was used on the cover of Koop Satellite Digest, which was one of the first satellite magazines. So what happened at the time was that there was a big interest in citizen diplomacy, and there was a company called Internews, and they asked me to help them produce some links between audiences in the Soviet Union and the United States. Unfortunately, these photos aren't very good. I didn't really have enough time to find good ones, and it's funny what you can find in the internet these days and what you can't find. This was the closest I could get to finding some pictures from this Soviet Congress bridge. And there was just one funny story. When I went to go into the Kremlin where they were shooting this, I didn't have my passport with me because my visa was being extended. So instead I showed the guard at the door my New York Health and Racquet Club card with my picture on it, and it worked. He let me in. So all night I was running up and down the corridors of the Kremlin with no ID but my New York Health and Racquet Club card. So at the time we were using telex to communicate. There were only 2 telephone lines between the Soviet Union and the United States. If you wanted to make a phone call, you had to order a call with the operator and sit by your phone and wait all day for the operator to call you back. We sent messages by telex, which you can see on the left. And then during these satellite links, Internews brought the first fax machine, what they called a video phone, to Moscow. And we had some fun with the soldier guarding the door, sending the first video conference messages back and forth from the States to Soviet Union. Victor Krylenko and I and Kenny were trying to start a lot of different projects. This was day, I remember we were going to Aeroflot, and we proposed to Aeroflot that they start a new business called Aeroflot Express, which would be an express mail service, but they didn't understand what we were trying to explain, so that never got off the ground. Here are some ration coupons. At the time, there was not a lot of things to eat. And since I was a vegetarian since the time I was 14, it was especially hard for me to find food. But I did find soon that the Bulgarians and the Hungarians were very generous in their pickled and bottled vegetables. So I used to eat a lot of pickled peppers and canned peas. And also, thanks to Fidel Castro, there were lots of grapefruits in the stores because the Soviet people didn't really know what to do with grapefruits. So I had a lot of those. 1986, if you can remember, the Chernobyl disaster happened. And after it happened, one of the engineers who we were working with, Robert Bishop, met some scientists and found out that pectin is a substance that can take radiation out of your body. So we brought some people from the United States who had a pectin factory to meet with the Minister of Agriculture of the Soviet Union to see if the Soviets wanted to get pectin from sugar beets in order to reduce the levels of radiation amongst the people who had radiation poisoning. And we brought these men to meet the minister, and I was standing in the middle of the group, and he shook everyone's hand, but he skipped over me because he thought I was the secretary, the Russian secretary who was translating. And as soon as he found out his gaffe, he sent his beautiful Chaika limousine the next morning to pick me up and drove me to a fur farm and asked me to choose my coat, thinking that that would be a good way to win my favor. I didn't mention to him that I was a vegetarian. I just said, thank you very much, but no thanks. So at the time I was very lucky. I got to meet some very interesting people. Mikhail Gorbachov, Andrei Sakharov, Yelena Bonner, Eduard Uspensky, Cheburashka and Gena, although I never really understood what Cheburashka is. Maybe some of you can explain that to me. And through Artyom Troitsky and some others, I was very lucky and got to meet Boris Grebenshchikov, Sergei Kuryokin, Pyotr Mamonov, and a lot of musicians, Группа Kino, Seva Gakel, Alla Pugacheva, Zhana Guzarova. In '87, there was a satellite link between 7 countries that included David Bowie, Namjoon Paik from South Korea, and Sergei Kuryokin and Pop Mechanika in Leningrad. I was a producer for the show, but Tamara Mikhailova, who was the host, grabbed me and forced me to go on camera. I didn't speak Russian very well, and I was pretty shy. And she made me share the screen with herself and a bear named Misha. And Sergei Kuryokin and Sergei Bugaev Africa took pity on me. And as soon as the show was over, they grabbed me and took me to the first Georgian cooperative restaurant on Fontanka. And I was really thrilled to make their acquaintance. Then, because of the work that we had been doing with the satellite connections, Gosteleradio allowed me to take MTV around Moscow and Leningrad, and we made the first film without an escort, a Soviet escort. We were on our own. And it's a film called Tell Tchaikovsky the News, which still today is a really interesting film that shows the underground music scene at the time. So you can all find that, I think, on YouTube. 1987 also was a big year. That was the year that Reagan and Gorbachev were meeting. And we decided to put together a children's space bridge to hold a summit meeting between Hryusha and Kermit the Frog. And this, we took Jim Henson to Moscow. I took Jim Henson to Moscow and Miss Piggy and all the Muppets. And we won an Emmy Award for this show. Unfortunately, this show I can't find anywhere online, and hopefully someday somebody will put it up online, because I think it's a masterpiece, actually. After this, we started to get a little bit more serious. We met with Vitaly Karotich, the editor-in-chief of Ogonyok magazine. Lev Gushin was his deputy. Valentin Yumashev was a young guy who was the deputy. And we decided that we were going to publish a book in the States, which included letters to the editor of Ogonyok, because this was the first time that a Soviet publication published letters to the editor. And we read and collected 1,000 of them and published a book with Simon & Schuster, which got a lot of good reviews and is still used at universities like Harvard and Princeton, because it is primary source material from that time. We also did a project with Life magazine in Ogonyok, where we sent Artyom Borovik to live in a US Army boot camp, and we sent an American journalist to live in a Soviet boot camp. I couldn't find anything online about the Life magazine article, but I did find this cover from Artyom's book. Unfortunately, he died tragically a little bit after this publication. We made 2 other books. We did 2 other books, or we helped to do them. One is Russia 1917, The Unpublished Revolution. This is Jonathan Sanders, my professor from Columbia, and they'd opened the archives, so he had access to a lot of photographs that no one had seen before. And Collins Publisher also had a series, A Day in the Life of different countries, and we managed to arrange them to take pictures from all over the Soviet Union. Took Mr. Rogers in 1987. And then, well, despite the fact that Reagan and Gorbachev were trying to end the Cold War, ABC wanted to show a miniseries called America about the Soviet Union taking over America. And the Soviets were really unhappy about this. So we went to Gosteleradio, to our friends at Gosteleradio, and Kenny called every TV station in America, and he finally found a small cable channel in Maryland, Bethesda, Maryland, called the Discovery Channel, which no one had ever heard of. And he asked them to preempt all of their programming for the next week so that they could show live Soviet television at the same time that ABC was showing this miniseries. And they agreed. So the week was called Russia Live from the Inside, and it won an ACE award and it got tons of press. I'll just show a couple of the articles. Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, New York Times. But what happened was, and I'm leaving this article up because it says the plan shifts. What happened was we were supposed to go live on Sunday night, and Friday at 5 minutes to 5, Discovery Channel received notice that what they were about to do was probably illegal, and that the uplinker, which is called Group W Cable, could lose their license if they go ahead with this project. So the reason that they gave was the 1937 munitions law, which said that Americans were not allowed to use any enemy equipment. Of course, they didn't have satellites in 1937, but they considered that Soviet satellites were enemy military equipment. And so they stopped us, they stopped Discovery from doing the project the way we wanted to do it, was to have them download directly from the Soviet satellite. But luckily for us, we had Victor and Kenny who never give up. And Victor called someone in the Politburo, we don't know who, and talked them into leasing us the Soviet satellite for a week. So the Soviet satellite, if they leased it to us for $1, would automatically become a US domestic satellite. But of course, the US government didn't see it that way. And they said, no, you can't do that either. You probably will still be doing something against the law. So what we ended up doing was we uplinked from Moscow to Intelsat, which is the Western satellite. And we also had some famous people like Diane Sawyer from CBS News carry over cassettes that we used. So it ended up being a mix. Some of it was live and some of it was taped. But it was a great success. After this show, Russia Live from the Inside, Kenny got a call from Charles Wick, who you see on the left, who was an old Hollywood hand, a friend of Ronald Reagan, and he called us to Washington. So Kenny and I drove to Washington and met with Charles Wick, and he was very upset because he said that he was promised that we had been stopped by his underlings, that the project would not go forward, but it did in fact go forward, and it was completely legal. But he said that he was worried that we were helping the Soviets to spread their propaganda, but they would never allow American television to be shown on Soviet television. And we showed him our plan was called the Mirror Project, which we had put together to do just that, to start to show some American shows on Soviet television. This is just a letter from Gosteleradio saying that Belka International has the license to start the first cellular network in Moscow. We never actually did that, but because of what we had done, they were supporting us in all of our ventures. And in the meantime, Kenny decided that we should bring a Russian rocker over to the States because we had seen some of the bands, obviously through Telchikovsky the News and Red Wave. And we thought that Boris Gorbachov was the perfect crossover star. He spoke perfect English. He knew everything about Western music. And so we went to all of our friends and contacts in the showbiz world, and we collected about 50 letters saying that we want Boris, we want Boris. Boris didn't have an exit visa. He was not an official musician. And it wasn't until the absolute last minute that he was granted an exit visa and put on the plane to the States. And everyone who met him fell in love with him. Everyone wanted to do a record with him, and he got record offers from all of the big record companies. David Bowie wanted to produce him, but he ended up choosing Dave Stewart to be his producer. And we made an album called Radio Silence. And then also in parallel, we were filming the whole project, and it turned out to be a very good film called The Long Way Home, which hopefully you can also see on YouTube. The film was made 30 years ago, but it still holds up. And it's really all about Boris's trip from Russia, from Leningrad to the United States and Europe and back again. These are just some pictures from Los Angeles, where we were shooting the film, and Boris was recording the music. He recorded the album in Los Angeles, New York, Montreal, and London. Here's Boris after being brainwashed by the CIA. Just kidding. And after we finished the album, we brought some of the musicians to Leningrad to play a concert together with Aquarium, which was also a great success. Lots of press in the West connecting the two countries. In 1990, I met my future husband, Alexei Haas, who's a DJ and designer from Leningrad. And after these cultural projects and after the Soviet Union disappeared, corporations were very interested in doing business in the former Soviet Union. And the first customer that contacted us was General Motors. They wanted phone links. And Kenny thought of the idea that we should use the more maritime satellites because being in Russia was sort of like being on a ship at sea. So we went and we got permission from Morsia Sputnik. We got about 15 permissions. And we gave General Motors their dial tone. 1991, Belcom was born. Belka International was consulting and production. Belcom was telecommunications. And a lot of the companies that wanted to work were oil companies. So we created an oil network called Petronet, a telecom network for oil companies called Petronet. We had 26 Earth stations all over the former Soviet Union. And Telecom Finland was our partner. We put an Earth station up at Porvoo, Finland, and we started to bring telephone lines and telephone calls in through Finland. My father lived in Finland when he was a Fulbright scholar in the 50s, and I wrote him a postcard saying that we found his girlfriend where he'd left his bicycle, because all of my whole childhood he told us he left his bicycle with his girlfriend in Finland and he had to go back and get it. So I wrote to him that I found his girlfriend and she's waiting for him to come pick up his bike. So these were some of the antennas that we had in our 26 node network. Robert Bishop and Ken and a lot of other people, including Lena Lukisu, who's listening. These are some of our clients. Oh, General Motors, Radisson Hotel, Chevron, Nizhny Khamsk Neftekhim, my favorite one, American Business Centers, You can read them yourselves. Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Novomoskovsk. And in 1992, ComSat, which was, it had been the government Ministry of Telecommunications, if you want to say, that was privatized, took an interest in our company and did a strategic investment. So we continued to work. This is Belcom, Kazakhstan, Tashkent. And our secret weapon, as Lena can say, were the korporativki, because we never paid anyone a bribe, but we did have licenses from the Ministry of Telecommunications for connection to the public switch, which was unheard of. AT&T couldn't get them. But because they trusted us and we had a good reputation amongst the top brass, we had no trouble getting these licenses. And we invited the Minister of Telecommunications to our korporativki, and that was our secret weapon. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, my husband had a club. First, he had the first underground club in Russia at 145 Fontanka, and then he opened a club in a bomb shelter called the Tunnel. And he did the Gagarin party in Moscow at VDNH, which was a huge success, never to be replicated. Meanwhile, here I am taking economists to the States. Shatalin, Stanislav Shatalin, Kravtsov, Bogomolov, Pechenyok. If any of you are economists, you probably know who they are. And we had meetings with the top people. We met with Henry Kissinger, the head of the Blackstone Group, the head of all the investment banks, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Pentagon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But my friends in Leningrad were missing me, including a lot of artists and musicians. Timur Novikov, Vladik Monroe, Georgy Guryanov, Olga Tabriluts. In 1993, there was a putsch in Moscow. I remember I was sitting at home and my Russian partner called me and said, I have to go pick up the foreign engineers. So I had to go right into the center of Moscow and pick them up. But I had my Zhiguli, and as soon as they all sat in my Zhiguli, it wouldn't go anywhere because they were too heavy. So we had to flag down another car to take them into a safe place. And a safe place turned out to be Kazakhstan. And subsequently, I decided with my daughter Sophie to leave Moscow, to leave this corporate world and move to St. Petersburg. And that's the end of this part of the story, but it's not the end of my story. So stay tuned for coming attractions. Thank you all very much.